Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the third episode of our seventh season of Diplomatic Immunity, where we'll be taking a look at the role of foreign policy in the upcoming 2024 presidential election. As we approach voting day on November 5th, we'll be taking you through the key things to know about where the candidates stand on international issues, how a win for either might affect U.S. diplomatic strategy, and how the rest of the world is watching with bated breath. Today, we're talking about how other countries are watching the election and what various actors may be hoping for. We'll talk to Dr. Tristen Naylor, founder and managing director of the geopolitical risk consultancy Diplomatic Solutions, about the outlooks for relationships with leaders in Europe, China, Iran, and other nations, as well as how America's relationship with multilateral institutions like the United Nations might be impacted by either candidate's victory.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Tristen Naylor. Tristen is the founder and managing director of Diplomatic Solutions, a geopolitical risk consultancy based in London. He was previously also an assistant professor and lecturer in history and politics at Cambridge University. His first book, Social Closure and International Society, Status Groups from the Family of Civilised Nations to the G20, examines how actors compete for a seat at the table in the management of international society and how that competition stratifies the international domain. Let's listen in on the conversation. I am excited to have with us today Tristen Naylor to talk about other countries' views of the upcoming U.S. presidential election. Tristen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Your work focuses in large part on international summits, G20, G7, things like that. So we're going to start off at that sort of 30,000 foot level view of how others are viewing the U.S. election. So when we think of these bigger groupings at the multilateral perspective, what are the two candidates' records on this? I mean, I know Harris doesn't have much of a record yet, but what are her views? What are Trump's views? Is it a contrasting approach when it comes to, say, the G20, the UN, NATO, and other major international fora?
Well, they have absolutely contrasting approaches to multilateralism. Indeed, Vice President Harris doesn't have as much of a record, but she is an avowed internationalist who has affirmed the importance of not just American participation in multilateral fora, but American leadership in the likes of NATO, the UN, the G7, the G20, and so on. The vice president, as well as her surrogates, have affirmed repeatedly their commitment to internationalism and have differentiated themselves from former President Trump by directly calling out his brand of isolationism as not just bad, but as dangerous, as being a position that runs contrary to American interests. And then in contrast, the former president's track record on multilateralism, we do have to analyze, and it is a very clear portrait. Let's not forget that one of his very first acts as president was to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Change Accord, striking a massive blow to the COP process, but also diminishing America's ability to lead on the climate agenda and basically leaving the door wide open for rivals, notably China, to pick up the mantle of leadership. And of course, he spent his entire term bashing NATO and has continued to do so throughout this campaign, and likewise spent the entirety of his presidency deriding the likes of the G7, the United States' closest allies. So all this to say they have dramatically contrasting approaches to multilateralism and internationalism, and the outcome of this election will mean a fundamentally different America on the world stage.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned NATO. You and I met in Montenegro this past summer, and Trump famously shoved the Montenegrin leader out of the way to get in the front of the line at a NATO summit a few years back. Very different views as far as international fora go. How does this play out? What does this mean for policy on, you mentioned climate, but other things like global health and things like this? Either party wins. How does that sort of play out on the policy side?
Most broadly speaking, either America will have a seat at the table in driving the agenda on the big issues that really matter, be it climate change, be it global health, or America won't. What's significant to note is that global health governance won't go away. Climate change governance won't go away in the face of either American withdrawal from multilateral leadership or even in the face of outright American antagonism towards it. It'll simply mean that others will step up to fill the spot abdicated by the United States under, say, a Trump presidency, which is exactly what happened, as we were just mentioning before, when the former American president took the United States out of the Paris climate change accord. So will global cooperation on these big issues be hampered? Yes, of course they will, but cooperation will still happen. You know, the United States is not the indispensable nation that certain narratives like to pretend or assert that it is. And so, in many ways, one of the questions facing the American electorate at the ballot box is over how they'd like to see the big international challenges being approached. Is it with America's interests being at the heart of a global approach or not? In some ways, I think this does highlight just how salient a departure the America First, the MAGA movement is from traditional mainstream Republican conservatism that really has served US foreign policy interests since at least Eisenhower onwards really well. And it's the position that American interests are best achieved when America is not just at the table, but sitting at its head. And this America First, this mega isolationism and transactionalism simply doesn't allow for that.
Yeah, and we've been talking about the larger international bodies, but in the past decade, there's been a lot larger of a role being played by regional bodies as well. And I mean, things like ASEAN, the OAS, the GCC, the Africa Union, things like that. And the US has interest in all these regions. When we drill down to the regional level, is the outlook between Trump and Harris still pretty much the same? And what role do you see moving forward? Do you see the role of these regional groupings getting larger and larger?
I think in this respect, the divide between, say, former President Trump's profoundly transactional approach to foreign policy and Harris's more general internationalism really emphasizes the difference. For former President Trump, exactly as we saw during his presidency, if he and his administration perceive there to be no clear immediate interests to the United States, then they don't see value in engagement. Trump, for example, only attended the ASEAN summit once in the first year of his presidency, and he cut his attendance short in a massive diplomatic slight. He did not attend at all in his remaining years in office, whereas Vice President Harris herself last year attended ASEAN. And while there affirmed the importance of the group to the United States, despite not being a member. And to be frank, this kind of stuff might seem trivial, whether a leader shows up at a regional summit, but it really does matter. Showing up matters. Not because necessarily going is going to result in some immediate deal, but because foreign policy and the diplomacy through which one achieves it really isn't that different from everyday life. If your friends invite you round for dinner, you go to dinner, not necessarily because you're going to get something out of it, other than presumably, hopefully, a good meal, but because they're your friends, and we all need friends, especially when things get tough. But if you keep turning down, if you keep snubbing, or even outright insulting your friends, they're not going to be your friends for much longer, and they're certainly not going to be there when you need them. And frankly, given the kind of world we find ourselves in, America could really use a lot of friends right now. And so participation in these fora, interest, investment in these fora really matter in that respect. But also to point to your second question, I think the kind of world that we are heading into is one in which regional groupings matter a lot more. I think the nature of geopolitical competition that we are seeing and certainly emerging into a world more defined by it means that the big global bodies are going to be less effective than the smaller regional ones, which makes things like ASEAN, things like the SCC, all the more important to engage with.
Yeah, I mean, eventually you're going to stop getting invited if you just keep saying no all the time. And I think, especially with something like ASEAN, like this is where the rubber meets the road as far as the geopolitical competition with China goes. And this is where you need to be to show up that we have something to offer that's different from China, that's better than China. And not doing that leaves the door open for the Chinese to be the only player in the room. And that's, I mean, we've started to see the Pacific Islands and decades of not paying attention or not really giving them their due has led to China making inroads in those places and things like that. And we need to be there. And, it always reminds me of the famous George Shultz quote of, it's tending the garden of diplomacy. You can't only show up when it really, really matters. It always matters. You've got to show up to those things. So shifting gears a little bit, we've talked about the different viewpoints of either a Trump administration or a Harris administration. What about the other countries' view of the election? Let's start with Europe, the place you probably know the best and where you're situated right now. How are the Europeans viewing the upcoming election? How are they bracing themselves for a potential second Trump administration?
Europe is viewing this election with trepidation, with white knuckles, with eyes hiding behind hands. If the former American president wins this election, at a minimum, it will mean 4 more years of, let's take NATO as an example, 4 more years of NATO having to defend itself in a rearguard action against, at the most extreme, dismantlement by what's otherwise been the largest and most important member of the alliance. And it is particularly a problem, a concern for NATO's European members, because it's not 2017 anymore. It's not 2021 anymore. America's European NATO allies would be having to deal with threats from Donald Trump while facing the most serious threat to its membership on the eastern flank since the end of the Cold War. But Europeans are particularly trepidatious about this election because even if the former American president doesn't win, Europe still nonetheless finds itself in a profoundly precarious position. The Biden administration had to fight hard to get Congress to approve support for Ukraine. And in all likelihood, this will remain the same under a Harris presidency. And again, here we can see just how dramatic a departure the America First, the MAGA movement is from traditional American Republican conservatism. Defending Western security interests used to be at the very heart of the Republican brand, and yet it no longer is. So even if Trump loses, Trumpism is almost certain to endure. And in doing so, Europe really needs to do some serious thinking about how to achieve its security interests without the guarantee and certainly without the reliable support of what had elsewhile been the most reliable friend, the United States. And this, it's really worth underscoring this. This is a massive departure from the post-war status quo. This is a huge strategic problem for Europe, regardless of who wins in November. And indeed, it's a huge strategic opportunity for those seeking to pounce on any weakness, on any discord within the West.
Well, and you speak about those that are looking to pounce on any discord in the West. So, what about those geopolitical rivals that the United States has, been speaking so much of for the past half decade or so, at least, some longer? So, where do you think America's rivals are sort of at as far as the election goes? Are they leaning one way or the other when you look at Moscow and Beijing and Tehran?
Let me start with the Kremlin. I think it's more than reasonable to assume that Vladimir Putin is waiting until after November 5th to make any big moves and make any decisions about possible big moves with respect to Ukraine. Because the outcome of the election will give him a very clear idea of quite what the strategic environment he faces in Ukraine will be. To put it at its most simplest, Kyiv will either continue to have the support of the White House or it won't. And that makes a huge and stark difference. The former president has, with his typically boastful and certainly ultimately empty bravado, claimed that he would end the war in a day. And not only is that ridiculous, even if we were to imagine that somehow he could, the only way he possibly could end it quickly is by ceding to the Russian president's wishes. And not only is that very obviously contrary to Ukraine's and Europe's interests, but it's ultimately against the interests of the West and certainly against the interests of the United States. And so I think Putin and everyone around him in the Kremlin is basically just sitting and waiting to see if the US electorate effectively hands him his victory in Ukraine at the ballot box.
Yeah, definitely not looking to make any, as you say, major moves before November 5th, because at this point, the longer he stretches this out, the better it's going to be for him, maybe regardless of who's in the White House, but especially if Trump wins in November and comes back in January. So US policy has, if there's any areas of similarity between the two parties at this point, it is being tough on China. Now, Trump has come out and said, calling for larger tariffs and, potentially up to 60% on all goods coming from China and things like that. And his potential team that would be coming in also focuses a lot more on China and sees that as the major issue. One reason why they want to steer away from Ukraine and Russia and things like that. But where do you think Beijing is as far as, who they're leaning towards, or do they really not care at this point? Or, what do you think they're thinking in Beijing?
Well, I won't begin to pretend or imagine I know what they're thinking, but I think you're probably right that there is certainly less divergence between the candidates on this front. And there are fewer implications, or at least dramatic implications, of the election on what happens next than, say, in the case of Russia and Ukraine. Irrespective of the election, we're very unlikely to see any easing of tensions with China, but where there are divergences is in terms sort of how the relationship will be handled. We haven't heard that much from Vice President Harris on specific policies with respect to China. I anticipate that it will be more or less what we've seen under the Biden administration, which is to say that this is by no means a easy relationship. I think it's going to be rocky going forward, but I think that the policy will be not to actively antagonize Beijing. The former president has promised massive tariffs on all Chinese goods at a minimum 60%. He announced as much as 200%, a 200% tax on Chinese cars, which makes it no wonder why Elon Musk has suddenly joined the MAGA crowd. And even if he does not go as far as a 200% tariff on Chinese cars, there is no reason to suspect, and certainly no reason not to suspect, that he almost certainly will exacerbate the trade war with Beijing, just as he did in his first term. It fits the narrative that's actually one of the central narratives to his movement. And again, exactly as you say, those around him are also profoundly hawkish on Beijing. So at a minimum, more of the same, but maximally things are likely, in the case of a Trump victory, to get worse.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, there's no stark black and white as far as China goes on the Trump administration like there is with Russia, Ukraine. Because on the one hand, there's going to be increased trade wars, more hawkishness. But on the other hand, Beijing's probably thinking to themselves, yeah, but he antagonizes allies, which he needs, Japan, South Korea, Australia, other countries. So it's a weird one. I mentioned Tehran and the view from Iran as well, assuming they are angling for a Harris win. But thoughts on Iran, but also, is there any others that we're sort of not touching on that you think we should be talking about too?
Well, on Tehran, again, I think it's dangerous to presume or suggest we have sufficient insight into what Iranian ruling elites' hopes are. We can certainly read some signs, but what I think we can say is that there is at least greater room for maneuver with a Harris presidency to take the temperature down in the Middle East. And one reason for this, I mean, has less to do with Vice President Harris, and as is so often the case, more to do with Donald Trump, who has, as is typical for himself, has painted himself into a corner with Iran. His rhetoric on Iran continues to be so absolute and incendiary that he's left with very little room for maneuver diplomatically. It's really hard to see how he could, even if he wanted to, which is a stretch, but how he could walk back from his hardline stance. So, just as the case when he was in office before, if he were to be re-elected, I think we're most likely to see things ratcheted up even further with Iran, but more broadly in the Middle East, as there is just such little room for hardworking diplomats to take even modest steps towards de-escalation. And things for over a year now have been, to put it mildly bad, have been profoundly, profoundly worrying. And the direction of travel in the past months and weeks has been frightening.
So let's end on this. We've talked about, the view from Europe, the different positions of the two camps in the U.S. election, and some of the potential views of some of the biggest geopolitical rivals to the U.S. But, to put it bluntly, what about the rest of the world? There's, over 180 countries we didn't talk about. So where do you see the rest of the world on this? The G77, the Global South nations, are they split on this? Is there a discernible view from these countries, or, do they care?
I think it depends case to case, and one of the difficulties that we have in talking about the Global South is exactly as as you well know, we're talking about such a broad array of different countries in different regions with different interests and positions. So it's what we can sort of tease out a little bit, what the two candidates' positions on the Global South is, despite the fact that, as is characteristic in certainly in American elections, not much is said about the rest of the world. I think in the case of Vice President Harris, we'll continue to see the sort of engagement with the Global South that has been seen over the past few years with the Biden administration. One signature initiative of this is the $3 billion pledge to the Green Climate Fund to support developing countries' investment in climate change prevention as well as mitigation. And we are very likely to see, however modest it may be, an articulation of that alternative to what Beijing offers the Global South writ large in terms of economic development, in terms of financial investment. In the case of former President Trump, I again would sort of pivot to analyze him through his transactionalism. I think he sees the G77 members, he sees the Global South as he does any other actor in the international community. They're only relevant to him so far as they have something to offer him transactionally.
Tristen, before we get you out of here, any other key things you're kind of looking for in the election, or thinking about from a foreign policy standpoint as we're going into this? It's getting close.
It is getting close, and indeed the race is frighteningly close. And look, I grew up in Canada. I've now lived in the UK for the past 16 years. And, the thing that always gets me every 4 years is just how significant an impact the outcome of an American election has on every country around the world and on everybody around the world, and how the rest of the world doesn't have a vote. And so it is kind of like, especially this year, being the passenger in a car that is driving wildly out of control. And so, you asked me earlier, how does Europe view the election? And I think I described it as white knuckling it and viewing it trepidatiously. And that is sort of how I'm viewing it. But I'm sincerely hoping when I go to bed on election night, I will wake up and things won't be as scary as they possibly could be. But it's, as you say, it's close.
Yes, it is. And I also fear that you will wake up the next morning and a significant number of mornings after that before we actually find out who's going to win, once we get past judicial hearings and lawsuits and everything else that I think is going to get thrown into this thing, barring a, unforeseen landslide victory by one or the other. I think that's what's in our future. All right, Tristen, I really appreciate it. And thanks for taking the time with us today.
Thanks so much.
Thanks again to Tristen for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Community. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett Dang. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.